welcome to all of those of you watching us and listening to us. It's such a great pleasure to have previous prize winners with us today, and each of them have been making a mark in ethics since they won the prize, and I find that very interesting. Their journey has been an interesting one. So let me go to the introductions, but before, just also give a slight qualification. Each of the speakers today are here of course, with their background and their professional background, etc. But they are speaking their own opinions, and we mustn't forget that. This is not Chatham House; this is open. So let's respect that. So without further ado. Let me go in turn in their order of speaking, not in any other order. We have with us Clare Payne, who was actually the first winner and is now a fellow for trust and ethics at EY Australia. She won the prize in 2006, in the edition of 2006-2007. What really was very interesting for me is that, Clare, since you won the prize, of course, you have done many things in ethics, and you'll be explaining that a little bit, your journey, but you're also a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader and recognized as an Australian 100 Women of Influence. That's fantastic. I love that. So, Clare, let me turn to you, and as each of the speakers come on board, I will be giving you their background. So, after receiving that inaugural Ethics and Trust in Finance, what inspired you to set up an ethical institute in finance, and how has ethics in finance evolved since then, since that time?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was a really great thing for me to receive the award in terms of validating some of my ideas and giving me some enthusiasm and support, really. And I wrote my essay when I was working in an investment bank in my mid-20s. And when I won the award, the CEO asked me to email a copy of it, and then he asked me up to his office after he'd read it, and we chatted about my ideas. And I've really been constantly working in the field since then. So I've gone on to found a banking and finance oath, which is like a Hippocratic oath for people that work in the finance sector. I continue to develop training and teach. I still hold the ethics role in an organization. And so I found that the prize was a really sort of good start. And now that I'm involved in the jury as well, I get to read, these ideas of young people. And I really do think it matters. Like I'm now in my mid-40s, I was in my mid-20s then. And I think we need these new ideas, these fresh, fresh eyes on the issues. And so the prize has really propelled me, I suppose, into the field. And I really work in the field of applied ethics. So I'm constantly thinking about how to apply what I know directly and try and influence for a more ethical work culture. In the 20 years, I would say I feel like ethics is in a better place than when we started. Almost every day there's something, ethics is mentioned in the news. People talk about social license and use other words that are proxies, I think, for ethics, like they talk about trust and honesty and whether something is fair. So in some ways, I feel we're in a better position. I feel we can use some of the new things like technologies and AI capabilities for good, hopefully, that can assist people that are working in the field of ethics in finance.
As you were speaking and saying that your CEO called you up and wanted to discuss your essay, I think that's incredible. And I remember some of the, high-level, very senior figures in the finance industry who've all been wanting to be associated with the award. And I can call to mind Christine Lagarde when she was at the IMF. We actually had an awards ceremony in Washington. And I can remember two commissioners of the European Commission, both with financial services, who were both impressing on me that they wrote their own speeches and they didn't let the speechwriter do it. That's how ethics speaks to people. It's individual, it's personal, you feel it. And I think that is something that I see in all of you, this enormous passion. And that I hope that the audience who's watching us and hopefully are going to be encouraged to write essays also feel. and know that, you know, the jury is a very interesting jury. I think we're about 20 of us with very diverse, you know, ideas, practices, backgrounds. And I enjoy, like you, Claire, I enjoy those jury discussions immensely. You mentioned AI, and of course, you know, it's every day we open our newspapers, something new comes up. You know, my 17-year-old is using ChatGPT, and she looked up my CV on ChatGPT and said, "Oh, wow, Mom, I have 5 pages of you." And I said, "Wow," you know, she got really worried. So, you know, there is so much out there. It's already way past where we think it's going. It's much faster than internet in terms of development. It's sort of, you know, it's exponential, you know, the new ideas, the new ways we can handle. And of course, it has concerns, but it also has opportunities. And it has opportunities both for regulators, you know, in Kenya or, you know, other developing markets. For example, when I talk to regulators, it was really interesting. They really saw it as an opportunity because you can kickstart a market from it. But also, you know, in some of the older economies, there are concerns and, you know, data protection, influencing, do we know what's happening? So would you like to highlight some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the whole discussion about the ethics of AI, I feel is like ethics in motion. Like as a society in different regions, we're discussing how this should work and what regulatory, you know, measures we should put around AI. And that is a good thing. I often point to it as like that's ethics in motion as a society where we're consciously discussing an issue. I feel like one of the issues that I feel could be positively affected by AI in finance is to reduce some of the information asymmetry that we have. So there's a lot of exploitation possibilities in finance where people don't have good advice or good access to information about financial markets. So I feel like AI can potentially reduce some of that asymmetry. Also help banks understand their customers better and to understand when someone's, you know, spending habits are changing and why that might be, for example, with gambling addictions or other hardships. So I feel like there are some positives for the customer experience and for the financial institutions to have better relationships. But of course, you know, there are a lot of risks which we're all aware of and probably involved in various initiatives. But I also feel like in terms of regulators, there's less opaque aspects of the market because we have more access to data and to information to understand how things work. And I think that's a good development.
Yeah, you know, one of the issues, of course, is, you know, are we enough trained to understand, you know, all the developments? And I think that that is an issue that I was hearing from global regulators around the world at the recent IOSCO annual conference. IOSCO is the International Organization of Securities Regulators. And I think, yeah, that, you know, and I think this is going to be with my next speaker, Simone. Simone Heinemann, who won the prize in 2010, 2011. She is currently an expert on operational excellence at HSBC. She's from Germany. And what I found really interesting, of course, you hold a PhD in the field of financial ethics, but you trained as a Six Sigma Master Black Belt. I love that. Yeah, I love getting this sort of information. Simone, what are your perspectives on the current challenges for financial industry on ethics? And I think, you know, it's this, I would love you to highlight a little bit what your thoughts are we prepared enough? Are we trained enough? You know, I remember during the height of the financial crisis, when I was working in the European Parliament, and one of the constant statements was, we need a thief to catch a thief. So, you know, to that point, are we as expert as those developing out in the real world? Are regulators there, consumers? Do we fully understand?
Yeah, hello everyone. Yes, as you said, I worked as a PhD and also as an assistant at the university and in Bochum, Germany. And after a while, I decided that I needed to do something more practical or see how the banking industry really works. So that's why I'm now working in a bank. And as you said, I'm working in operational excellence. So it's a quite technical issue that I'm facing in the moment. So in my current role, I am elaborating preventive measures to ensure regulatory compliance, and it's about implementing internal controls to ensure compliance and also legal standards. And what I'm really interested in is, I like this technical side, but I'm very much interested in seeing the ethical side as well, which is something which is not usually being done in a bank. So so I'm also interested in the question, how can we ensure a commitment of the whole organization on every level to ethical principles? And from my experience, I can say that bankers are not that much interested in answering these questions to me. So I need to find out ways to understand better and to talk to them more directly. So what I did in the past was I provided ethical training to new employees, and that's very important, I think. So the topic ethics in finance becomes more relevant for them from the beginning. But in addition to that, it's also very important to set up a risk culture, or a culture of ethical thinking in an organization. So you need continuous training throughout the years, not only at the beginning or at the onboarding of a new employee. And because I'm convinced that a robust risk culture not only protects the organization from potential threats, but is also very important for stakeholder trust, for example, and for long-term sustainability of the organization. So yeah, that's something that I'm very much interested in, and I think it's an ongoing thing. So you will never arrive at an end and be able to say, now we are an ethical organization, but it's something we need to work on every day.
Simone, you mentioned bringing that ethical culture to that, or to your organization. Of course, you know, it's very different whether you talk to the board, whether you talk to a middle level manager or an entrant. The problem you have with organizations that are for-profit organizations is that they need to make money. And I remember very vividly when I just joined CFA Institute back in 2013, we came out with a joint study together with the Economist Intelligence Unit. And we basically surveyed middle managers, senior managers in the UK and several other countries. And what was interesting is that all the senior managers said, oh, yes, you know, we've put in place an ethical code. We really subscribe to this. This is how we work. But when you talk to the middle managers, they said, yes, of course, we believe in ethics. And, you know, we're being taught about ethics. But if it's concerning my bonus at the end of the year, or if I need to get a new client and I have to be slightly more flexible, I am going to be slightly more flexible. So this is an issue, you know, when you go through the chain. Of course, you know, compliance departments, risk departments now report separately into the board, and that is good. But still, we have this issue through the chain of, if you work for profit organization, you need it's your your profitability, and so this is a real challenge, and also being able to speak up and have a voice. So different countries have different ways of looking to seniority. Some countries respect senior managers above everything. What they say is the word of law. Other have perhaps a more easygoing way. I'll never forget when I started my work in the City of London as a young 22-year-old graduate. I was told by my CEO in the investment bank to call him by his first name. And that was a signal of the culture of being able to approach. You know, if you have to say Mr. So-and-so or Charles, hello, quite a different way. So what is your take on that ladder, and how you can catch any abuse or unknowing attitudes to ethics?
Yes, I totally agree to what you just said. It's not an easy thing to do, and what you need to think of is that there are diverse elements of a risk culture or a culture of ethics, such as you mentioned, the tone from the top, for example. Of course, you need management who is willing to support you, and who is willing not only to sign a code of conduct just because you need it, but who is convinced that this is an important thing. And some other elements of this are, of course, risk awareness. People need to be aware of the risks they are taking, because they are not only affecting themselves or the stakeholders, but the risks can, of course, affect the whole economy and the whole welfare of everyone. If you just think of the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, for example. And of course, one aspect which is also very important is the performance and reward system within an organization. So if people are awarded because they take a lot of risk, this is of course not the right thing to do. But yeah, these decisions need to be taken, taking into account sustainability and ethics, of course.
And I remember, I think it was Virgile who introduced us, who actually did a really interesting, during COVID, an interesting video about the Danone case. Danone is a French company and was one of the first to actually say it became, according to the French law, a company with the purpose of doing good for society. And it got really hammered by impact investors. The CEO at the time, of course, now is leading the HSBC in terms of sustainability developing standards. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult when a company, you know, it has to make profits. The shareholders may slam if you devote part of it. So, you know, this dialogue is incredibly important, and it's incredibly important for the sustainability issue that we're all dealing with, ESG coming into it. And I think to highlight some of this, I'm now going to turn to my next panelist, Julie Segal, who is a senior manager at Climate Finance Canada, and actually won the Ethics and Trust in Finance Prize of 2020-2021. She is also a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics, Grantham Research Institute. And Julie, you've since the prize, but also before, you were very heavily involved in both that ethics and sustainability, and looking at just transition issues. So I'm really curious as to also where that perspective is going to come in. In your original essay, you were discussing the need for environmental justice when talking about pricing in the fiscal risk from climate change. Because people forget, you know, we think it's just ESG is just about climate, but it's the social, it's the governance, and it's that ethical component that is very strong. So for you, what are the challenges and opportunities specifically of this approach for banks and other financial institutions?
Thank you, Josina. As you mentioned, a core piece that I focus on in my work and in the paper for Ethics and Trust in Finance is how climate change and climate justice relate to what we've seen as sustainable finance and the rise of that. I'll talk a bit about my journey and how that influenced my thinking for this paper. And since at the time of writing the paper and for many years for many years before, I had been managing an impact investing fund. But I had the pleasure of working for an institution that really did prioritize positive impact investing in terms of, for example, renewable energy for Indigenous communities, which was owned and operated by those communities. Yet that was at a time when ESG was really on the rise as a trend. So as someone working at an asset owner in impact investing, I had many knocks on the door for funds that were claiming to be impact investing, true sustainability, but were really a bit lighter of an ESG overlay, to say the least. It became very apparent to me that within environmental social governance investing, the ethics guidance was not there. The financial system is still designed for profit, quarterly earnings. That's a fact of the system. And working as someone with a very earnest impact investing mandate, I found that ethics was simply not appearing in environmental social governance investors from the preponderance of asset managers or project proposals. What I wrote about in the paper is particularly how that dynamic affects climate change and climate justice. With the rise of environmental social governance, we saw a significant rise in disclosure requirements. Report on your carbon emissions, report on your climate risk.
what I analyzed is that within the current system of finance, simply reporting on a risk analysis ends up penalizing the regions who are most vulnerable to climate change. So to put it simply, if a country or a location has higher physical climate risk, they're more likely of a flood, a wildfire, to be, inundated by rising sea levels. That will increase their cost of capital. Yet that region is probably, in general, those regions tend to be less wealthy and have historically contributed less to causing climate change. That's hugely unjust in a way that doesn't align with what we would ethically like to see in the world in terms of addressing climate change. It also worsens climate change because it means that these regions aren't able to access capital to invest in reducing carbon emissions or building climate resilience. A pretty big problem, which regrettably in the years since the prize, we haven't quite at a level. But I think it was a really important piece to highlight a concrete example where the financial system is kind of bumping up against its boundaries as it's presenting within an environmental social governance lens, but again, has boundaries which are restricting real ethics from moving into how that system functions. So back to how that related to my personal journey, I have since shifted to a role where I'm working from a nonprofit organization to advance sustainable finance policy and regulation. What I found was that all of these ESG funds, which to my concern and disappointment weren't properly able to address the environmental justice factors, were working within their appropriate mandates. They weren't doing anything illegal by being unethical or unjust. They were delivering exactly what the majority of their clients and their regulation expects them to deliver. Right now, my work focuses both globally and particularly in Canada, where I'm based, to advance new policy that considers climate and climate justice factors, more the impacts of your investments, and to think about how that can be more formally designed into the way our financial system works. I, in my paper, recommended a few solutions for tackling environmental justice, one of which was regulation. Others were collaborative action and voluntary action. And in the years since, what I've seen in the market and seen in my work has very much led me to see new policy reform, modernization, as I often call it, as the real solution to bring ethics into the way our financial system works.
I think, it's true, and regulation on its own cannot do it. Neither can, the community do it. We need partnerships. We need public and private partnerships. We need partnerships between academics and regulators and stakeholders. We need to be open with each other throughout the value chain. And I think, ethics has such an important role to play. And actually, the International Ethics Standards Board, who is looking at ethics for accountants, has developed ethics for sustainability reporting. Again, it's important. Ethics brings dialogue. Ethics brings questioning, awareness. And that is important as we go up the knowledge chain and the, how to deal with the fact what you said was that, the most fragile countries are the ones that actually, need more help and need to build into their consciousness. And, we're also talking about the livelihood. In Poland, I think a third of the country is in mining. There are whole provinces that are totally dependent on mining. You cannot just in the transition say this is bad. You have to think of, that just transition and that, equitable, ethical way of dealing with the challenges we have in society. I'm just going to ask you very, very quickly on the Climate Aligned Finance Act, which was introduced in Canada in March 2022. And this encourages the financial industry to make more climate commitments. When you spoke about regulators, I guess you meant that act. Would you be able to go a little bit into it, what your take on it is and how it might help, the move towards more sustainability?
I would be glad to, Josina. And I'll tie this to what you said in the opening, that often when people think about regulation, I find in so many conversations, first of all, people's eyes glaze over, or they tend to think of it as a stick, as something harmful to the market. Whereas I always look at policy as a way to modernize the way things are working to address and meet current challenges, as well as to balance the needs of a just climate transition, the needs of our time to address environmental and social and human issues by modernizing the way our systems work. And the Climate Aligned Finance Act was a really interesting example of consultative policy. I had the pleasure, the Climate Aligned Finance Act is a policy proposed within Canada, which is currently working its way through our Senate. It would align our financial system with climate action and has been quite globally celebrated by a number of domestic and international experts as a model policy for modernizing our financial system for climate change. In terms of being consultative, I had the pleasure of being an advisor, one of a handful of advisors on developing this bill, and that's why I highlight the consultative piece. It brought in experts from across the financial sector, both globally and domestically, as well as climate experts, to ensure it was really grounded in what stakeholders need. That's one really important piece that I think when we're talking about modernizing finance is so important to consider. One of the key pieces of this bill is that it focuses, this policy proposal, it focuses on the impacts of financial institutions more so than just the climate risks to them. And it does tie in a number of those the important environmental justice factors, like considering Indigenous rights, adaptation, and how to ensure those pieces are central towards climate investing. What's really interesting, the Climate Aligned Finance would essentially require transition plans from financial institutions, which is quite similar to what we're seeing in other jurisdictions like in the United Kingdom, European Union. And it would also upgrade the supervisory permissions of regulators, which is a second complementary piece that I find very interesting. Not only has the financial sector not been primed to appropriately think of ethics when it comes to the challenge of a just climate transition, but often regulators, in speaking to many regulators, don't feel they have the mandate to pursue that level of supervision over their financial institutions they regulate. A number of other regions, again, I'll point to the EU and UK, whose policies on sustainable finance I envy and admire, have upgraded in many ways the roles of the regulators and how they engage on climate change. The Climate Aligned Finance Act shows quite a bit of leadership in tying in the broader perspective of how this can both protect the market from climate-related risks, but also mobilize the market for a more just climate transition. So it's been a real pleasure to work with Senator Rosa Galvez on the Climate Aligned Finance Act and to see the global support for that bill.
I can imagine how interesting, and you rightly refer to the EU and the UK as a sort of building that sustainability path. I'm going to turn to someone and look perhaps more at the people working in the finance industry again, because that's of course what his original essay was about. But my last panelist, Ross Murdoch, he is interim head of department in the Enforcement and Market Oversight Division at the Financial Conduct Authority of the UK, the FCA, and he won the prize in 2014-2015. Now, it was really interesting, of course, because Ross, your essay was about ethical CVs and behavior of the next generation, the young people in finance. And I think, this is something for you. You've worked on market abuse and manipulation, LIBOR, all these misconduct issues. You're also a lawyer, so you have this very strong take on what you have seen. I know you're speaking in your own capacity, so again, I do qualify qualify this, but of course you have your experience. Now, in your original essay, you did speak about the idea of an ethical CV for financial services professionals. Do you think this would contribute to reducing unethical behavior?
Yeah, well, look, it's lovely to be here and talk about this. It's 10 years since I wrote my essay, and I remember, actually, it's an important point, I think, for people joining to think about not be intimidated by, what am I going to write for this jury? What experience do I have? I wrote that essay when I was 27, and I very much approached it from my own background, thinking about, well, what is my experience? I think that is incredibly important for people when they're thinking about writing their essays. They do have, to Claire's point earlier, really useful insights to give. And when I think about it from my perspective, as I say, it was 10 years ago now, so I'm not quite as young as I was then. And so my ideas have shifted slightly in terms of understanding what I would do for young people in the particular context. I mean, my particular focus was thinking about how people make ethical decisions in a workplace context and what their background was, and then putting in place measures to kind of safeguard against ethical biases. I think there's things that we can think about today that are become more emphasized with younger people today that definitely would be interesting to explore. Some of the points that we've discussed earlier, young people place a high value on transparency. So having that kind of broader ethical understanding, whether it's kind of your ethical CV, if you like, or having an open culture where decisions are explained transparently. Simone talked about tone from the top. I think that is really, really important. I also think when I was looking at the context in which people make decisions, that was back when people were mostly in the office, there was no AI, and so the context has shifted, and there's probably a greater degree of separation between actions and consequences. And so that's a new dynamic that we need to think about, particularly as we're managing people and staying connected. I completely agreed with Julie when she talked about kind of the broader purpose that organizations might pursue. I think it's perfectly legitimate, in my view, for organizations to pursue economic purposes, but the reality is that it needs to be rooted in the wider impact on society. Frankly, as employers, we need to do that. People want to work on bigger, meaningful missions rather than just making money on the whole. So I think we need to do that so that we attract people. And I think what is really good about this prize is that it gives, as I say, it gives a platform. You mentioned earlier, and Claire mentioned some of the opportunities that you get as a result of this. I was at the IMF when Christine Lagarde was speaking ahead of giving the award. Then found myself in Brussels with the EU Commissioner for Financial Services. I mean, it was an incredible experience, and I think that's exactly what is great. Claire said it, fresh ideas, and making sure that particularly senior people have that different perspective, because we are continuing to change perspectives all the time, and we need that feedback.
Ross, you touched upon it briefly, but I want to take you a little bit into your own personal journey. You said that your focus had changed slightly from that ethical CV to more that awareness of the bigger purpose of working for the common good of society in a way. How has ethics been incorporated into your daily work practices?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I mean, obviously I look at generally speaking, my day job involves investigating people who have been engaged in misconduct, right? So what was fascinating to me is often as part of that, you're investigating a matter, interviewing people, gathering information to try and determine whether a rule or a piece of legislation has been breached or a crime has been committed. And you do get into motivation when you look at that, but actually it's more around establishing what the legal case might be and trying to find out what has happened. But the great thing about actually being able to spend that time doing the research for this paper was that you could start to think about a bit further back about how over time people might be influenced into making unethical decisions. And that applies no matter what you do. You know, it applies, in any workplace, because, if you think about how we're shaped, we're often probably overly define ourselves by the jobs that we do. We, go into roles thinking that represents me, and I want to be seen as a success in whatever it is I choose to do. And you don't really find out about what a role entails until you do it. And for some people, they find themselves with great mentors and great support, and that rubs off. Others, we find in more difficult situations, and so you will find that good people, so-called good people, will find themselves in situations where the expectations from their colleagues, their superiors, are that they'll engage in misconduct. And actually, that's really hard, because we'd all like to think we'd do something about that. We'd stand up for justice, but the reality is that a lot of time people really struggle with that. So it's important to know what the pressures are to be able to, as I talked about earlier, to put in place mechanisms to support people. I think a bit of self-awareness is very important too. How do I portray myself in the workplace? Do I compartmentalize my work identity from my personal identity? And actually, one of the things that certainly over the past 10 years, people have been trying more and more to increase diversity of thought in the workplace, allowing people to bring more of themselves to work. And I think that's really important, because it breaks up the kind of cultures that you don't want to see. So for me, it's actually, it's more about actually understanding how we make decisions. That was very important to me. The late Danny Kahneman's work was quite recent then, and it was a bit of a light bulb moment when I read his work, thinking here is a framework to be able to explain how people make decisions, and then you can apply it. You can apply it in lots of different contexts. So things have changed, I suppose, with the benefit of experience. But the one thing that I think is still as relevant today as ever is being able to think about what we would do if faced with someone trying to get us to behave unethically, and then thinking about how we put in place support measures for that.
I think that's really important. What would we actually do? Now, we are almost into the end of our time. We have 2 minutes, and I'm going to use those 2 minutes. I'm going to ask each of my panelists for 1 or 2 sentences of where you think we need to go with ethics in the next 10 years. Claire, up to you.
I've always felt actually that I would love if more remuneration and reward structures rewarded people for being ethical and reduced the emphasis on profit. So some type of balancing out there, I think, would be good progress, along with trying to recruit different types of people into the finance sector with a range of backgrounds rather than just people that are focused on the numbers.
Fantastic. Simone.
I would say that we need more ethical training at schools already. What is ethics in finance? This is something that students need to know. And of course, in organizations such as banks, starting from the onboarding, from the new employees, going on with training. And yeah, for me, this is the most important thing.
Lovely. Julie.
Modernizing financial policy and regulation to better address the current challenges of our time is very important. I think it would be due humility for us to recognize that the financial system was designed in a way to meet certain needs, but could, of course, have missed meeting others. And I think that's very important for us to remedy straight from the top.
Lovely. Ross, final thought.
For me, I think I'm always a fan of bottom-up change. So actually, as new people come through and provide new ideas about how to tackle these old problems, I think we need to listen to them. I think central to that will be thinking about what is the purpose of work and how we want to act in the workplace. So I think we can do that with lots of good ideas, hopefully coming through from the prize, the people applying to win the prize.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Claire, Simone, Julie, and Ross, because you've given different takes on it. I think your final comments were very illuminating. Really, thank you very much for your openness and for sharing your experience throughout the years.